Hey, Melody.
Hey, so good to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I have a great, juicy reader questions. It just screamed Melody Wilding to me when I read this. So I'm going to read it off to you, and then we'll get into your best ideas and tips for this
Sounds
question.
good.
So a reader asks, I'm really overworked, and I feel like I'm constantly on the edge of burnout. But I also know that a lot of that stems from my own fear of saying no to extra work and projects, especially when it's coming from my manager or the CEO of our company. Any advice for how to be more confident setting boundaries with authority figures at work?
Yeah, and let me also say this person has amazing self-awareness to realize that when the power dynamics come into play, the ball game changes because you can't just say to a VP or someone who's more senior than you, no, I don't feel like doing that, or no, I don't have bandwidth to do that. Sorry. So you do
Right.
have to be more tactful and diplomatic. What I would tell this person, first tip, is dig for details. Ask questions first. This does a few things. It gives you a moment of pause to recollect yourself, especially when something's just being dumped on you. It's very easy to panic and freeze in that moment.
Sure.
It also gives you more information about the request because, on the face of it, you may not know if it actually could be a good opportunity to get exposure or build a skill. You want to understand that a little more deeply. And it also shows you're being collaborative, you're looking for solutions and problem solving. And through the other person responding, they may divulge some information that gives you something to latch on to say, oh, actually, this other person would be a better fit for this request. So some of my favorite questions for things like that are, you could say, could you tell me what's driving the urgency around this? Or can you tell me why I came to mind specifically for this request? Do you see this becoming a regular part of my role, or is this sort of a one-off? Please help me understand who else is involved, or who will this work be visible to, right? All of those things can help you get more of the nuances that you need.
Totally. I love this. It's like it's using the old therapist trick of when a client lobs you a really hard question, you just like sort of ask them a question back and like get them to start elaborating more, which isn't really a trick because often they have the answer inside of them. It's not on us to figure it out. But I love this one. I love a lot of those little scripts, and it reminds me of a little tip that I like to give is always just to remind ourselves. Almost always, you can punt or sort of like delay. You can say, oh, yeah, like I can see, I appreciate you thinking of me for that. Let me think about my schedule, or let me think about bandwidth or whatever, and I'll get back to you tomorrow, or I'll get back, and give yourself a little bit of time. But I love that this takes it a step further with this idea of digging into details and asking them for more details specifically.
Yeah.
Really
And
helpful.
what you're saying is actually another strategy I talk about in my book. I call that the deferral, which
Mm,
is, oh, thanks for sharing all of this. Let me take a look at my calendar. And if I could just add like a little bit of improvement to that, which is, if you can throw something in that shows how you deferring or taking time to think about it is actually in the other person's best interests. So for example, let me take that back to the team. I want to make sure we have bandwidth to take this on and
nice.
actually give it the effort it's due. And so you're showing, hey, I'm looking out for you, other person. I'm not just, punting this to the side and I'll get back to it.
I love both of these too, like your original tip and that one too. I think they really answer this question particularly because they get at the confidence angle too. Part of what makes these situations feel stressful is when we feel like we have to react right away. But if you know that you have some built-in kind of strategies to give yourself a little space, it makes going in less anxiety producing, not without anxiety, but it makes it less intense. So I love that one. How about number two?
Yeah. So when you are dealing with people who are of higher authority than you, again, we have to understand what are the invisible dynamics that are at play here. And you and I both love the psychology of this. And I don't think we talk enough about how that comes into play in the
Mm,
workplace, but this is a perfect example of that. And so we have to think about, what is your pushback power in this situation? What is your leverage to actually say no? How directly can you do that? And when your pushback power is on the lower side, meaning someone has more experience, greater tenure than you, take those sorts of things into account. And when you're on the lower side, you can use what I call the conditional yes, which is, you can agree to a request, but make it clear that it's an exception. So you can say, I'm happy to take this on this time. I know this is urgent for the team, However, I hope we can both recognize that in the future, I may not always be able to accommodate this quick of a turnaround or this type of timeline. Or you can say, again, happy to jump in, to volunteer to take this on. At the same time, could we revisit this in a week or two to make sure that if something like this comes up in the future, we have a way that we can be proactive about these types of requests? So again, it's striking the balance of being collaborative with setting somewhat of a gentle boundary, an expectation that this can happen in the future.
So good. It reminds me a lot of one of the things I always tell people with boundaries is setting boundaries is one thing, but enforcing them is another, right? And often enforcing is actually harder than setting it in the first place. But what I like about this tip, the sort of conditional yes, is it sort of sets the expectation that you will say no or enforce this boundary later on. So it's not surprising to them and it doesn't catch them off guard later on. So I like how it's a way to think about setting boundaries, but it's also a way to make it easier on yourself later on to enforce those good boundaries.
Yes, you hit on it exactly. It gives you a precedent to come back to later, to say, remember back in Q1, I mentioned that I may not always be able to accommodate this. This is one of those situations. So can we look at another compromise here? And I can get you this piece by Friday. I can prioritize the rest of it next week. Does that sound good to you? So you're right. It gives you something to fall back on.
It also, one other thing that just occurs to me is it's really helpful to the other person because you're being both respectful, but also sort of laying out clear boundaries. But I think it's also really empowering to ourselves. I feel like so much of what detracts from our confidence in situations like this is we kind of know we're going to go into it and be a pushover and we'll just kind of do whatever. And that's like so dispiriting to sort of know that about yourself. But to have a new plan where you, even if you are ultimately saying yes, you're doing it with some sort of strength and thought about the future. You're kind of, in a way, you're standing up for your future self by being really clear about precedents going. And I think that in the moment is actually confidence building, even if you are saying yes and not doing like a hard, definitive no at the time.
Yes, that's a fundamental shift here, is seeing yourself as less of a subordinate and an order taker that is just like you were saying, pushover. You ask me a request and you say jump, I'll ask how high. Yeah. To seeing yourself as more of a partner or an advisor, because that shift is really about, I'm making my leader aware of constraints I have or limitations they may not be aware of. And that puts you on more equal footing rather than you just being in reactive, passive mode.
Something I think about with this is that and you probably have experience with this too, I do a lot of consulting with kind of senior executive teams. And one thing I hear from them all the time is that they're really unsure of like what's too much or what's not enough for the different people sort of under them in the hierarchy. So they actually, a lot of them, even if they don't know exactly how to ask for it very well, they want clarity like that. They want that sort of information from you about like, I can do this, but this would be too much, or I could do this, but not at this time, or all those details. For a lot of managers and leaders, that's actually really helpful information. They actually welcome that and want that instead of seeing it as as like a burden or you being, difficult or something like that.
So true. And you can also add a little bit of that context when you deliver list to say, let me walk you through some of what we're up against or what we're balancing so you understand the full picture. Because I know at the end of the day, we want to do right by this client or we want to make sure this project is successful. And so again, you're showing I'm coming to you more as a partner and a collaborator rather than trying to be difficult for no reason.
And also, I mean, this gets to your book on managing up. This is such a good way to sort of position yourself as the kind of person who takes initiative and is responsible, right? And is thinking about the big picture, not just their own little, kind of the details of their own little situation, which if you do want to sort of move up and be seen sort of differently within an organization, that's a great way to do it, is to handle these boundary setting scenarios really, not just respectfully of the other person, but really confidently, having thought through a lot of these different aspects of things. So I love that answer on so many questions, Melody. All right, well, let's get to your third and final tip.
Yes, this is also another technique you can use, and I call it the tradeoff approach. And so this is another type of reply you can give, especially when your pushback power is on the lower side, you're dealing with someone with much higher authority. And the key here is about putting the decision making back in that person's hands. So a moment ago, we were talking about how part of your responsibility is to surface maybe those conflicts or priorities. This is essentially saying, I'm focused on getting number one done in the time that we talked about. Adding number two to that would impact that timeline. How would you like to reprioritize? What would you like me to delegate? What would you like us to slow down on? And so again, you're presenting, it's almost like this idea, I think it's called the illusion of choice, right? Where I'm sure you've had this with your kids, where it's not a question of if you're going to wear pants today, it's which pants you want to wear. Do you want the yellow or the polka dot ones?
Right.
And it's the same idea here, that you are creating the container of the options. You're giving them a binary option and making the decision from that point. But again, the ultimate decision rests with them. And so they're still maintaining authority over it.
Yeah. And I love this. The language of trade-offs, I think, is so helpful for everybody involved, right? Because the temptation is like, no, I can't do that. We're like, okay, fine, I'll do all that. But instead, if you can kind of come back and frame things in terms of, yes, I could do this, but it would require this. It would come at this cost to me, to the organization, to you, like whatever. Or we could do this, which would have its own set of trade-offs, but maybe these are actually a better set of trade-offs given the circumstances. So trade-offs is just such a more, I think, kind of helpful, constructive way of thinking through difficult decisions, including kind of setting boundaries on big asks. That I'm glad you included that, because I think it's such a good thing to work into our mindset and language and how we talk, especially in situations like this. All right, Melody, thank you. These have been really helpful. Is there anything you would like to share? I know I'm going to plug, you have a new book coming out in a couple of weeks, Managing Up. Tell us a little bit about the book real quick, and why people might be interested in it.
Yeah. And thank you for having me, Nick. I always love being with you, always love conversations with you. The book is called Managing Up, How to Get What You Need from the People in Charge. And one of the main ideas behind the book is that managing up is not something you do for your boss's benefit. It's something you do for your own benefit, for your own level of confidence and feeling of agency in the workplace and in your career, but also creating the conditions for your success. And so if anyone has ever felt like, well, managing up is just brown nosing or sucking up, that's not at all what we're talking about here. And the book is filled with just every chapter has dozens of different scripts and really tactical strategies. So if you enjoyed this conversation today, then I think you'll enjoy the book.
Awesome. Thanks, Melody.
Thank you.